22, the supremacy of the Son of God. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. In the midst of the world where few people had tons of power, where there was people who, in the midst of their hopelessness and grief, wanted a religious war and battle, came Jesus Christ. At the heart and soul of who Jesus Christ was this understanding of who God was and who we are called to be. One of the foundations of this early church that helped to not only establish who they were was this understanding of who God was and how the world should move. And that's one of the reasons why we're taking time to go over and study the Apostles' Creed. Not understanding it not just as the words that are there, but what is the message and the things behind it. People didn't have Bibles. It wasn't a resource that was available to them, so to understand the story, to understand God's movement of redemption, they memorized little things like this, the Apostles' Creed. So they could have a fuller understanding of who God was, who they were, so they could live with boldness. They could move in faith. They could help them to create schools, hospitals, orphanages. They established the movement of charity, of justice, of peace, of community that changed and transformed the world that they lived in. That when claimed, when it lived out, continues to change and transform the world today. So we've been going over some of the statements and some of the things of belief. We talked about God, Father Almighty, that understanding this role of God as being loving and caring, connecting with power. That God is not only the author of heaven, but the author of earth, and that the desire is for there to be unity and connection between heaven and earth. This kingdom that is to come, where they're united together. This understanding that God demonstrating power and love, and demonstrated it through coming down and taking on our form, saying that you're a reflection of my image, and this is what you're called to be. You're called to live as this reflection. And so came down with all the power of God, but submitted that power, surrendered that power. Just as God asks us to surrender our power, what we have, to raise up those around us, to help them live as they would otherwise not live. And it's interesting, we focus so much on what Jesus' teaching is, but it's amazing to see that in the Apostles' Creed, it doesn't go and say, well, Jesus taught this or Jesus taught this. What it does is it emphasizes what he did. He suffered, he was crucified, and was buried and rose again. It's interesting that what he did is also meant to embody what he taught. What he taught is meant to embody what he did. that there's something important and impactful about why Jesus came, and why Jesus was fully God, and why Jesus allowed his life to be taken. And what that means for how we not only understand God, but also how we understand ourselves. Because I tell you what, if you misunderstand who you are and who somebody else is, it's really hard to be loving and caring, is it not? You know, when I was a boy, third, fourth, fifth grade, actually from kindergarten to about fourth grade, I could go a mile in either direction and there wasn't a single boy to play with. If I wanted to play with somebody that was close to my age, it was going to have to be girls. Yeah. We played a lot of house. And that wasn't the most fun in the world. But guess what? When I was about, I think it was fourth grade, we had a boy move into the area. And I tell you what, I was overjoyed. I mean, it was just a hop, jump, maybe a quarter of a mile, maybe half a mile away, just running through the woods. I could get to his house and we could play, or he could come over to my house and we could play trucks, cars, vehicles. We could do all sorts of things. And but when I started getting a little older, some of the things started to change. See, I started getting more excited about playing outside than playing inside with trucks and cars. I wanted to go and play sports or climb trees or go for long hikes. And, he couldn't do that. And not only that, he was a little different, acted a little different than some of the friends that I had at school. And I noticed our friendship started to drift. In fact, it wasn't really him drifting away from me, it was me drifting away from him. Because I had this interest in doing all this other stuff. And we didn't have video games back then. They had the systems, but neither of us could afford them. Otherwise, maybe that could have solved some of our issues. But I started drifting away from him, and I started thinking, well, he's just not interested, doesn't like the things that I want to do. When engaged, the thing is that this was his condition. He couldn't play sports because he's wearing leg braces. His legs were disjointed, out of place. He couldn't run, so he had to wear braces to try to get them into alignment so he could eventually maybe walk without them someday. And it's amazing to think back then, as just a young child, that I could sit there and say, I should have known better. Should have known better that it wasn't about him not being a good friend to me, it was about me being not a good friend to him. Just because he couldn't do the things I wanted to do, he couldn't act the way I wanted to act, behave the way I wanted to act, behave, do the things that I thought were interesting. It didn't make him not a good friend. It didn't make him not loving. It just was the condition that he was in. And if I wanted to be a friend to him, I had to love him where he was at. I had to embrace him where he was at. I had to care for him where he was at. When Jesus comes down into the world, the understanding is that Jesus is coming into the world to embrace our condition, the depths of who we are, because in a world full of rules and of law, not to say that we shouldn't aim for perfection, not to say that we shouldn't want to do the right thing, but if you're going to be in a world where your call is and desire is for people to be holy as God is holy, you also need to make sure that at the heart and soul of that, 100% of the understanding of that is God's desire for us to know that we are loved and cared for, and that God is a graceful God. Because the reality is, oftentimes what destroys our ability to be healthy people in healthy communities is shame and guilt. What destroys our ability to be the best us is the fact that oftentimes we beat ourselves up for the ways that we feel like we have failed in this world. And because of that shame and guilt, it oftentimes causes us to distance and disconnect ourselves because people aren't coming up to our standards. People aren't meeting us. They can't participate in the ways that we want them. So we look upon them with a judgment. I mean, it's the reason why Jesus Christ comes into the world, because he knew how broken our world was when it came to matters of shame and guilt. There's a sociologist, researcher called Brene Brown, and one of the things that's really neat about some of her studies that she found out is that she studied actually, kind of addiction. People that seem to make continually bad choices over and over and over and over again, despite how much help that they get. And one of the things that she found that was interesting is that at the heart and soul of their problem wasn't that they didn't want to do good, but they were so overwhelmed by shame and guilt that they refused to be vulnerable to those around them. That they had lost that sense and understanding that they were good enough. They didn't have people that fed into them or fed into them or have that understanding of how good they were. And so they continued to not be vulnerable. Because that vulnerability, because it's one thing to know that you're good enough. It's another thing to have enough faith in that where you're willing to be vulnerable. And so we have God that comes down in Jesus Christ, and He died. He suffered. He died. He had all the power not to do that. All the power to make it end and to make it stop. I mean, literally was stripped down naked on a cross. Do you want to talk about vulnerability? You want to talk about physically being vulnerable, suffering the pain that you know you don't have to, but you're willing to because you want humanity to know. You want them to know that, guess what? A price has been paid. I have taken away all your sin, all your shame, all your guilt. It is mine. You think that this world is made and it's all about you and you doing the right things? It's all about community. It's all about communion. It's all about the beautiful paradise that I've created for you, and it begins with being graceful and loving and sacrificial towards each other. It begins by being able to be honest and open. And I've put at the center of human history my love for you, God says, in Jesus Christ. And then there's absolutely nothing, even death itself, that God cannot conquer. So there's nothing that you have ever done that God is not bigger than. That God cannot raise from the dead. That God cannot give new life, new birth, restoration. And we see this lived out in that early church community. And we see that lived out whenever there is like that growth and that movement of God's love. We see that continually, that people are being willing to be vulnerable to one another. In Acts 6, there's a situation where there's some widows and they're not being fed, they're not being taken care of, and they're being left out. And there's a curiosity. Are they being left out because they're different? Are they being left out because they're on the outside? Are they being left out because there's no voice? We're not 100% sure why they're being left out. But what we do know is the community was such. Here you had the disciples. You had the top people on the totem pole. And in a world 2,000 years ago, it's not much different than the world it was today. The people at the top of the totem pole have the power. And the reality is you don't tell them what to do, because if you do, they'll make you suffer. You have pain. You have difficulties. But what you see in Acts 6 is you see these individuals, Stephen, Philip, a couple others, and they come to the disciples and say, guess what? These people are being left out. These people need help. And you had a community that became vulnerable in how they cared for the least, the lost, and the left out. They gave up what they had so that others could be fed. And they did that, and we see that multiplied over and over and over again, not just in physical possession, that vulnerability in physical things, but that vulnerability in spiritual as they confessed, and as they said, you know what, guess what, we've fallen short here. We need help to be better. And I love it because you have these disciples, they look to these guys that are on the outskirts, and they look for them to help to bring healing to their community. And you get an understanding that this whole perspective of Jesus dying on a cross, laying the life down, is not just about, I'm forgiven, okay, good, doesn't matter what I do or say. It's enough in what God has done that we can be vulnerable, that we can be helpful, and that we can be fed by that Spirit that gives us strength to be that. Well, to be a disciple. Which is really to be a reflection of Jesus in this world, to claim that God has called us to be like Jesus Christ. They understood that discipleship was about being a reflection of, that literally you wanted to emulate and act and behave and have the character of the one that you were following, wanting to be a disciple of. And we're called into that today. And so, you know what, here's the deal. Being vulnerable kind of stinks, doesn't it? What I mean by that is it's not easy. We live in a world that tells you your garbage should be your garbage. You're good enough alone. Take care of it yourself. But yet we have a gospel that says, guess what? You're best as a body. And it's one of the reasons why we're forming Connect groups. It's not just about relationships. It's just not about helping to get to know each other better. It's also creating space and place where we can lean on each other. Where we can see Jesus in ourselves, but we can also see Jesus in others. And we're willing to be vulnerable. So, because being vulnerable is that reality, nothing more powerful. Nothing's more powerful than saying, guess what, I messed up today. And having somebody there that's willing to love you. And you see Christ literally, physically being lived out in your midst. You see a living sacrifice. You see Jesus Christ literally embracing you as he embraced you on the cross. I mean, the reality is that we live in a world, 40% of people are struggling with addictions. Many different individuals are struggling with depression, not because there is some of that where it's just literally physical things that are going on in the brain, but some of it's because of the conditions and the shapes, the way that they've been treated and hurt and abused. They have been told that they're not good enough, and they haven't had people walk with them to give them faith enough that they can be vulnerable. We are a loving, caring, compassionate people. May we be filled with the Spirit of God. And we recognize not only our condition, that we stood before God in need of grace, and that the world that we live in is filled with people that need that same love and response. And so do you have something that's weighing you down when it comes to shame and guilt? There's something that you need to share. Think about that right now. What's God laying upon your heart? What baggage do you need to get rid of? And I want to encourage you, I tell you what, I encourage you to find somebody to share that with. Go before God asking for strength. So you can share and take that leap of faith. And is there somebody that you're seeing in this world that's physically vulnerable, whether it be a neighbor, whether it be somebody in the community, or somebody halfway around the world? There's something in your heart that's saying, you know what? I want to be vulnerable. I want to give up myself to help others. Or maybe just your church family. So during the time of offering that we're going to have here, let's not just claim the freedom, but let's also let us claim the love upon our lives. Jesus came, and he suffered, and he died, and he rose. And that's about victory and love. It's about victory by claiming grace as center of who we are, who we're called to be, and what we're called to share. And so, in the next few moments, we're going to have a song that's going to be playing, and it's actually it's a song that just goes over the creed. And so we're going to have a time of offering. You can listen to it, or you can sing along to it. Really, it's up to you. I encourage you to sing along to it if you can. It's just, like I said, it's just a rendition of the Apostles' Creed. May this time of offering be a time that we're not just putting stuff in the plate, but may it be also a time when we're just laying our lives before our loving, caring, and grace of God. Ushers, take up.